Everything we collectively own on this planet, every house, every stock, every business, is worth around $450 trillion, according to the UBS Global Wealth Report. That's the equivalent of about 7,500 Jeff Bezoses, and roughly 40 of them have vanished offshore. We've already shown you how corporations and billionaires stash their wealth overseas on our video on offshore banking. But that leaves a bigger, more interesting question. What's in it for tax havens themselves? Why would tiny countries bend their laws to protect the richest people on Earth? Well, let's find out. Welcome to Alux. We're beginning today by talking about the scale of the offshore world. Because right now, somewhere between $8 and $12 trillion is sitting offshore, hidden in tax havens. That's more money than the entire GDP of Japan, which currently is the world's fourth largest economy. Imagine every product, every salary, every tax payment Japan makes in a year, and then imagine it vanishing into shell companies in secret accounts. As you might expect, this does have some consequences. According to the IMF, governments lose $400 to $600 billion every year in tax revenues because of offshore wealth. Research in countries like Norway shows the wealthiest 0.01% hold about 1/3 of their assets offshore. In places like the UK, Spain, and France, that number climbs to 40%. Every dollar that doesn't get taxed offshore is a dollar governments make up for by raising taxes on wages, on consumers and small businesses. That's why your paycheck feels squeezed while multinational corporations can report record profits. Offshore finance shifts the tax burden from the top down to the middle. So, what exactly is a tax haven? Well, the definition is pretty straightforward. A jurisdiction that offers very low to zero taxes, strict financial secrecy, and a frictionless way to set up companies or accounts. So in other words, they've turned their legal system into a financial product. Instead of taxing corporations, they invite them in with the promise of almost no taxes at all. Now, when people think of tax havens, they tend to imagine tropical islands like the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, or the British Virgin Islands. And, they're not wrong. Those countries host trillions in offshore funds. But the geography of tax havens is much bigger than that. In Europe, Luxembourg, Ireland, Switzerland, and Liechtenstein have built financial industries around being tax-friendly. In Asia, Singapore and Hong Kong dominate, while in the Middle East, Dubai has become the new magnet for mobile wealth. And this isn't only for billionaires, okay? Corporations depend on tax havens just as much. Apple routed its European profits to Ireland, funneled them through the Netherlands, and finally moved them to a mailbox company in Bermuda. This legal structure saved the company tens of billions of dollars in taxes before regulators finally shut it down. In 2021, ProPublica leaked IRS data showing that household names like Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, and Michael Bloomberg legally paid close to zero in federal income taxes in certain years, despite their net worths climbing by billions. And it's because they don't live off salaries. Their wealth sits in assets, trusts, and offshore structures. And until they sell those assets, which is never, the system doesn't treat them as taxable income. You see, the Cayman Islands has around 70,000 residents, but hosts over 100,000 registered companies. There are literally more companies than actual people living there. Luxembourg, a country smaller than Rhode Island, is the second largest investment fund hub in the world, right behind the United States. Which leads us to the real question here. Why would these countries not only allow it, but build entire industries around it? Well, to answer that, we need to look at the business model of tax havens. Billionaires use tax havens to keep their money private. You might not be hiding billions in Luxembourg, but your information is just as valuable. Right now, every website you visit, every app you open is being tracked. Advertisers build profiles on you to sell you more stuff, and data brokers are trading your personal details behind your back. And it gets worse when you travel, okay? Every time you log into public Wi-Fi in an airport, hotel, even your favorite coffee shop, someone could be watching what you're browsing or trying to steal your credit card details. That is where today's sponsor, NordVPN, comes in, okay? Go to nordvpn.com/alux, and with one click, you can anonymize your entire online activity. No one, not hackers, not your internet provider, not even data brokers, can see what you're doing. It encrypts your traffic, hides your IP, and makes your digital life private. Think of it like your own offshore account, but for your data. Get 4 months extra on a 2-year plan at nordvpn.com/alux. It's risk-free with Nord's 30-day money-back guarantee. Stay safe, stay private, and now let's get back to business on how tax havens actually make money, okay? Let's talk about the business model of a tax haven. So for a country not to go bankrupt, it needs to collect taxes from its citizens in order to pay for roads, schools, hospitals, and grow the economy. Tax revenue is literally the backbone of state finance. Without it, governments collapse, which makes tax havens almost unbelievable, right? They collect virtually zero in traditional taxes. No income tax, no corporate tax, nothing. On the surface, they shouldn't even exist. And that's because you're looking at them as countries, when in reality they operate more like businesses. Their product is a zero-tax environment, and you're paying an annual fee to be a part of it. It's essentially a glorified subscription model for the ultra-wealthy. They just so happen to have their own flag and national animal. Random fact, for the Cayman Islands, it's the blue iguana. And speaking of the Cayman Islands, they collect zero corporate income tax, yet it's still one of the world's top financial centers. Every company incorporated there pays annual registration charges. Every hedge fund, insurance firm, and bank pays licensing fees. Every foreign worker in the financial sector, and there are a lot of them, we'll talk about it later, needs to pay a steep work permit cost. And interestingly enough, the numbers aren't even that high. For a basic offshore company, you can pay as little as $3,250 upfront, which includes government filing, a registered office, an agent, and legal documents. And you'll pay about the same annually. For more complex structures like hedge funds, fees climb up to around $50,000. Even the bare-bones government cost is around $1,000 per year just to keep the company in good standing. And if the numbers seem kind of low, just remember there are more companies than actual people in the Cayman Islands. The result is that more than half of Cayman's government revenue comes from financial services. Billion-dollar companies would rather pay a few $1,000s in fixed fees than millions in taxes. And for the government, these fees add up quickly to hundreds of millions of dollars annually without burdening a single citizen. And that is just the fees alone. Tax havens also create an entire domestic industry out of offshore money. In Jersey and Guernsey Islands in the English Channel, financial services make up around 40% of the GDP. Lawyers, accountants, auditors, compliance officers, thousands of locals work in high-paying jobs thanks to offshore finance. If you train to become an accountant in one of these islands, offshore banking is pretty much the only job in town. This creates a professional class whose livelihood depends on keeping the haven alive. Banks, law firms, and consulting companies lobby to preserve the system, ensuring it remains profitable and stable. For small jurisdictions that would otherwise depend on tourism or fishing, offshore finance is the difference between stagnation and prosperity. And then there's the political leverage. When you host trillions of dollars in foreign assets, you suddenly matter on the global stage. Tiny countries that should be irrelevant in international politics suddenly become indispensable because they act as custodians of the world's wealth. Luxembourg is a perfect example of this. A country smaller than Rhode Island, yet it's the single largest investment fund hub in the world, managing over 5 trillion euro in assets. Its financial industry gives Luxembourg influence inside the European Union far beyond its size. Some havens take this model even further by using offshore capital as a springboard into broader development. Singapore, once a struggling post-colonial city-state, used its low-tax regime to attract banks and multinational companies. Over time, that money funded world-class infrastructure, top universities, and advanced logistics networks. Today, Singapore is a global financial powerhouse, with finance making up about 14% of its GDP, and a reputation far more stable than Panama or the Caymans. Now, if you take a closer look, you will notice a pattern here. All of these places are small. A couple of islands in the Caribbean, a dot in Europe like Luxembourg or Liechtenstein, a city-state like Singapore. You see, smaller countries mean fewer people to support and less ground to cover in infrastructure. It's like, 100 bridges in Luxembourg, hardly a strain on the budget. Maintaining a handful of motorways is relatively cheap. Running hospitals for less than 500,000 people is manageable, which is why financial products are far more profitable to them than taxes. For a small nation, charging global billionaires to park their wealth brings way more money than taxing their tiny domestic population ever could. And some nations did a great job, becoming stable powerhouses, while others, well, not so much. There are winners and losers here. Not every tax haven makes it. Some rise into global financial powerhouses while others collapse the moment regulators shine a light on them. And that difference between winners and losers reveals what tax havens really are. Take Luxembourg. Once a steel economy, today it's literally the richest country on earth per capita. With a population smaller than Boston, it leveraged offshore finance into a position as the world's second largest investment fund hub, managing trillions in assets. Then there's Singapore. It began as a low-tax jurisdiction, but unlike pure secrecy islands, it reinvested offshore profits into hard assets: seaports, airports, universities, and legal stability. Today, Singapore is the global hub to be at. And finally, Switzerland. Once synonymous with bank secrecy, it pivoted toward wealth management and financial stability. Even after its secrecy laws were dismantled, it stayed competitive because it had built a brand of trust that went far beyond hiding money. Now, compare that to the losers. Panama is an obvious one, right? The Panama Papers in 2016 ripped the curtain back on its secrecy industry, and the fallout was brutal. Clients fled, regulators pounced, and Panama never recovered. Or take the Caribbean microhaven places like the British Virgin Islands. They're the equivalent of a guy in a trench coat selling you life insurance for your pet goldfish. Entirely dependent on mailbox companies, no diversification, and constantly just one blacklist away from disaster. Then there's Cyprus. For years, it thrived on Russian capital until sanctions and EU pressure pulled the plug for obvious reasons. Practically overnight, its offshore industry evaporated. The pattern here is obvious, my friend. There's a fork in the road. Reinvest and evolve, or depend and stagnate. The winners used offshore finance as a launch pad for infrastructure, education, and legitimacy. The losers stayed reliant on secrecy and incorporation fees and eventually collapsed under scrutiny. And look, okay, here's the bigger picture. For as long as we live, everyone from individuals to corporations to entire nations will look for ways to survive and thrive. Tax havens turned sovereignty itself into a product. They exist not because they're profitable for billionaires, but because they're profitable for the havens themselves. And as long as the wealthy need a home for their money, there will always be a small nation willing to sell them one. Thanks for spending some time with us today, Aluxer. We'll see you back here next time. Until then, take care.